Here's a question that might shatter everything you think you know about God and free will. What if God isn't controlling your life from some distant throne, but you are God temporarily forgetting your true nature and pretending to be controlled? Comment below if this idea feels liberating or terrifying. There's no wrong answer. If you're new here, welcome to our podcast where we dive deep into Alan Watts's most revolutionary teachings. Hit subscribe to join thousands exploring these consciousness-expanding insights. Most people imagine God as the ultimate controller, a cosmic puppeteer pulling strings from heaven, deciding who gets blessed and who gets tested, orchestrating every event according to some divine master plan that we're too limited to understand. From this perspective, spiritual life becomes about surrendering to an external will, accepting that someone else is in charge, and trying to align ourselves with decisions being made about us rather than by us. But what if this entire picture is not only wrong but the very source of our spiritual suffering? What if the idea of God as controller is actually what prevents us from experiencing true freedom, authentic surrender, and genuine spiritual liberation? What if Alan Watts was right when he suggested that God is not in control because God doesn't need to be in control, because God is control itself, expressing itself as the natural order of existence, including your own deepest nature? This is one of Watts's most radical and liberating insights, one that completely transforms our understanding of divine will, personal responsibility, and what it really means to surrender. He saw that as long as we think of God as an external controller and ourselves as subjects being controlled, we remain trapped in a fundamentally dualistic relationship that keeps us feeling separate from the divine, at odds with existence, and powerless in our own lives. The traditional model goes something like this: God has a plan, God makes decisions, God controls outcomes, and our job is to accept, obey, and surrender to this external will. When good things happen, we thank God for blessing us. When bad things happen, we either blame ourselves for somehow deserving it or trust that God knows what's best, even when we can't understand it. Either way, we remain in the position of subjects being acted upon by a separate divine agent. But what if this whole framework is based on a fundamental misunderstanding of what God is and what you are? What if God is not a being who controls things, but the very intelligence that things are? What if divine will is not something imposed on existence from outside, but the natural way existence expresses itself? What if you are not separate from this divine intelligence, but are one of the ways it experiences and expresses itself? When you see it this way, everything changes. God is not controlling your life because God is your life. The very consciousness looking through your eyes, the awareness experiencing your thoughts, the intelligence beating your heart and growing your hair, and orchestrating the incredibly complex symphony of your biological existence, without any need for conscious control or effort. This intelligence doesn't control you from the outside, because it is you from the inside. It doesn't impose its will on you because your deepest will is its will. It doesn't make decisions about your life because you are one of the ways it makes decisions. The apparent separation between divine will and personal will dissolves when you recognize that at the deepest level they were never actually separate. This recognition is incredibly liberating because it means you're not a victim of cosmic forces beyond your control, and you're also not responsible for managing a universe that's too complex for any individual mind to comprehend. You're neither powerless nor omnipotent. You're something much more interesting. You're a unique expression of universal intelligence, temporarily experiencing itself through the particular filter of your individual consciousness. From this perspective, what we call surrender is not giving up your will to some external authority, but aligning your surface will with your deeper will, your conscious desires with your unconscious wisdom, your ego's agenda with your soul's purpose. It's not about becoming passive, but about becoming responsive. Not about giving up choice, but about choosing from a deeper place than fear, conditioning, and social programming. Think about moments in your life when you felt most free, most alive, most authentically yourself. Were these moments when you were trying to control everything, forcing outcomes, imposing your will on circumstances? Or were they moments when you were flowing naturally, responding spontaneously, acting from some deeper source of wisdom that seemed to know exactly what was needed without having to think about it? Most people find that their peak experiences, moments of love, creativity, insight, or profound aliveness, happen not when they're in control, but when they've temporarily let go of the need to control. Athletes call it being in the zone. Artists call it being in flow. Lovers call it losing yourself in the other. Mystics call it union with the divine. But in every case, it's characterized by the dissolution of the sense of being a separate someone, trying to control separate circumstances. This is what true surrender looks like, not the surrender of defeat, but the surrender of recognition. Not giving up your power to someone else, but recognizing your true power as an expression of universal intelligence. Not becoming passive, but becoming so aligned with the natural flow of existence that action arises effortlessly from the deepest source of wisdom. But here's where most people get confused. If God is not a separate controller, if divine will is not different from natural law, if you are an expression of universal intelligence, then what about personal responsibility? What about moral choice? What about the apparent reality that some people do harmful things and others do beneficial things? Does this perspective eliminate ethics and individual accountability? Watts would say absolutely not. In fact, it makes ethics more important, not less important, because when you truly understand that you are not separate from the whole, harming others becomes literally harming yourself. When you really see that the same consciousness is looking through every pair of eyes, cruelty becomes not just morally wrong, but experientially self-defeating. When you recognize that you are part of the web of existence, rather than separate from it, caring for the whole becomes the most natural and intelligent way to care for yourself. The difference is that ethical action arises not from fear of punishment or hope of reward from an external judge, but from the recognition of your intimate connection with all life. You don't avoid harming others because God will punish you, but because you understand that others are other expressions of what you most fundamentally are. You don't help others to earn divine favor, but because helping others is literally helping yourself in the deepest sense. This understanding also transforms how you relate to your own choices and actions. Instead of constantly second-guessing yourself, trying to figure out what God wants you to do, attempting to surrender your will to some external authority, you learn to trust the intelligence that's expressing itself as your deepest intuition, your most authentic desires, your clearest wisdom. You begin to see that the voice of conscience, the pull of genuine love, the inspiration of true creativity, the longing for meaning and connection, these are not separate from divine will, but are ways that divine will expresses itself through your individual consciousness. You don't need to surrender to God because you are God, temporarily experiencing itself as you, temporarily exploring what it's like to be human through your unique perspective. This doesn't make you grandiose or eliminate humility. If anything, it makes you more humble, because you realize that what you thought were your personal achievements were actually expressions of universal intelligence working through you. What you thought were your individual insights were actually cosmic wisdom arising in your particular field of awareness. What you thought were your private struggles were actually universal consciousness exploring the human experience through your life. But it does make you free in a way that's impossible, as long as you think of yourself as subject to external control. You're free because you realize you were never actually controlled by anything separate from yourself. You're free because you see that your deepest nature is identical with the intelligence that moves stars and grows flowers and creates galaxies. You're free because you understand that true surrender is not giving up your will, but discovering what your will really is when it's not filtered through fear, conditioning, and the illusion of separation. This freedom is not the freedom to do whatever you want without consequences. That would be the pseudo-freedom of the ego that still believes in separation. This is the freedom that comes from wanting what the universe wants, from choosing what life is already choosing, from flowing with the current rather than swimming against it. It's the freedom that comes from realizing you are not a separate wave fighting against the ocean, but the ocean itself, temporarily experiencing what it's like to be a wave. When you live from this understanding, decision-making becomes much simpler and much more natural. Instead of trying to figure out what God wants you to do, you learn to sense what wants to be done through you. Instead of trying to surrender your will to divine will, you discover that your deepest will is divine will. Instead of trying to let God control your life, you realize that you are the way God lives life, experiences life, explores life. Your prayers become not requests to an external deity, but conversations with your own deepest wisdom. Your meditation becomes not an attempt to connect with something separate from yourself, but a relaxation into what you most fundamentally are. Your spiritual practice becomes not a way to please God or achieve some transcendent state, but a way to remember and embody the divinity that you've always been. This is perhaps the most radical spiritual teaching possible. You are not controlled by God because you are not separate from God. You don't need to surrender to divine will because your authentic will is divine will. You don't need to let go and let God because you are God, temporarily playing at being human, temporarily forgetting your true nature for the adventure of remembering it again. The ultimate freedom is not freedom from God, but freedom as God. Not the freedom to do whatever you want, but the freedom that comes from wanting what you are. Not the freedom of the separate self, but the freedom that arises when the separate self is recognized as an appearance in the infinite freedom of consciousness itself. God is not in control because God doesn't need to be in control. Control implies separation. Someone separate controlling something else separate. But when you see that there is no separation, that what you call God and what you call yourself are different names for the same reality, then control becomes unnecessary. There's only the natural, effortless expression of universal intelligence through countless unique forms, including the beautiful, irreplaceable form that you are. Stop trying to surrender to God and start recognizing that you are what God surrenders as. Stop trying to let God control your life and start realizing that you are how God lives life. Stop trying to align with divine will and start understanding that you are divine will, expressing itself through human experience, exploring what it means to be conscious, to love, to grow, to discover truth through the extraordinary adventure of being temporarily, magnificently, divinely human. If this perspective feels like coming home to a truth you've always known but forgot, share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear how this lands for you. And if you're ready to dive deeper into Alan Watts's teachings that dissolve the illusions keeping you from recognizing your true nature, subscribe and join our community of awakening souls, exploring the deepest mysteries of consciousness and existence.